Hello, and welcome to the Undergraduate Field Experiences Research Network webinar series on 21st century field education. I'm Kari O'Connell. I'm the PI of UFERN, and I'm hosting this webinar. So today's webinar is our third webinar in our series, and we're going to hear from Dr. Allison Jolley at University of British Columbia about Can't Beat It on a Good Day, investigating student experiences on field trips with different instructors and variable weather. Just going to do a little bit of introduction and webinar logistics, and then I'm going to hand it over to AJ in just a minute. First, I just want to take a second to explain what UFERN is all about. It's a research collaborative research coordination networks project funded through the National Science Foundation. And our focus is on building an open and inclusive network that fosters effective undergraduate field experiences through several objectives. Sharing evidence-based models and practices, adapting, developing, and sharing assessment tools, looking at how to broaden participation and retention of undergraduates, and finally to harness the power of a network to do research on student learning. And we're very glad to have all of you here with us today. So I just want to put a plug in that our next webinar will be a little off our kind of regular time. It's going to be on January 24th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And we're going to be hearing from David Mock about entering the community of practice, learning acceptable behaviors in the field, and we'll send that out through the listserv in all our usual ways, and we hope to see you there. And then just a little bit before we get started about webinar logistics and what this will look like. So all of you participants out there should be muted already. If you have any resources that you'd like to share with the whole community on the webinar, please use the chat box, and we'll save any of those and post it online, along with the recorded webinar and any resources that come up in our discussion or from the presentations. If you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box at any time, and then we're going to allow plenty of time for questions, usually about 15 minutes at the end. And we'll go through those questions at that time. And then the other thing that we're going to try for the very first time is just a quick poll before we get started. So I think we just launched that. It's just one quick question. So I'm going to give you all a minute or two to answer how did you hear about this UFERN webinar? We've been sending it out to lots and lots of listservs, and we just kind of want to know which ones people are learning about this webinar on. And as you're doing that, just a reminder, we'll be recording the webinar and posting it online afterward. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Allison Jolley, and she works for the University of British Columbia as a Science Teaching and Learning Fellow within the Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And her work, most of her work involves supporting faculty in the implementation and evaluation of student-centered and evidence-based teaching practices in lecture, lab, and field settings. And AJ's research interests are about understanding the affective side of student experiences on undergraduate geology field trips, and particularly with respect to field places and landscapes. So our UFERN project has a focus on kind of more of the biological and ecological side of things, but we invited AJ to share her very relevant expertise, even though it focuses on geology. And she's going to be talking today about Can't Beat It on a Good Day, investigating student experiences on field trips with different instructors and variable weather. We're also lucky to have Lori Rock as a special guest, and she's the Big Idea Zoo founder and visual map artist, and she collaborates with AJ, and she'll be joining us to create a real-time visualization of content that'll be discussed in the webinar and pictures, and you'll have a chance to see that near the end of the webinar, and it will also be shared online as well. So AJ, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kari. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. How does that look? Hopefully that's good. And what we're going to be talking about today, as Kari mentioned, is investigating student experiences on field trips with different instructors and variable weather. So this title is a bit of a shout out to Wellington, New Zealand, as most of this work was conducted in the field in New Zealand. I was worried that it might show my notes. Let me figure out. At least you've got the full story on Wellington there. Let me just change my display so that we are on duplicate. And hopefully that's good there. Oh, that didn't work. Hopefully that's good. Perfect. So I just wanted to say a welcome to Lori from Big Idea Zoo. As Kari mentioned, she'll be showing a visual map at the end of the webinar, or the progress of the visual map and what we've been talking about today. And then that'll be available for download later on. So before we kick off, I just wanted to acknowledge all of these amazing folks who have been involved in this work. Sometimes when we get to the end, we miss all the acknowledgements. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone gets acknowledged here. Particularly the student and instructor participants who've been involved in this work. Anyone who does educational research and educational work knows that we don't learn anything unless we have the generous time of students and instructors who are willing to share their opinions and their perspectives. So a really big thank you to all those folks. Great. So just a quick outline for today. We're going to talk a little bit about the research context for this work and the question that we focused on. We'll throw to some working definitions of student experience and sense of place, because those terms can mean a little bit different things for different people. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll introduce you to our research setting and our mixed methods design, and then we'll highlight some student results, both in student perspectives and in their place attachment with the field area. And I'll bring this together to highlight what we think are some consistent design characteristics for field trips. So what we think really matter for kind of ensuring that students are getting the same and comparable experiences in the field. I'll wrap this up with a model we put forward for place attachment over time and how this develops in the field, and then highlight where I think some future work should be done in this area and summarize. And then we'll throw to Lori, and then we'll ask for questions. So first thing I'm wondering is, why do we all think field education is important? So take a minute to think about this. Try and sum it up in 1 to 5 words, so not a paragraph, just the first thing that comes to your mind. Take a minute to think on your own, maybe jot it down on a piece of paper, just hold it in your head, and then I'll ask you to share it in about 30 seconds to a minute. Thought I might get to see your chats here, but we'll figure it out. So when you're ready, if you could just type into the chat window. So if you pull up the bottom of your Zoom window and pull up chat, and make sure you select all panelists and attendees if you're able to find that on the dropdown, and type in your 1 to 5 words. Why is field education important? There we go. Great, so we've got connections between abstract ideas, being there in the field, bringing the ideas together, transferable skills, real world experience, participatory science. They stick longer, so it stays with you on a longer time scale. Connection to the real place. Yeah, hopefully we'll get a lot of chance to talk about that today. Real world experience and connection. Awesome. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to wrap up there. But feel free to keep typing and discussing as we move forward. Awesome. So there's lots of great things there, and pretty in line with what the geoscience literature says. So I'll give a quick caveat there that really what I'm familiar with is largely the geoscience literature. I imagine many of these things are similar in other discipline-based field studies, but I am by no means familiar with that body of work. Here are just a few of the key things that come through in the literature: engaging with the real world, developing transferable skills like teamwork and communication, preparing for careers, forming those geoscientific identities. So a lot of students say it's the first time I felt like a geologist or a real geologist. Developing those bonding opportunities between peers and also with instructors. So bringing those instructors down to a level that's human and relatable for the students. And it's important to highlight as well that this really does touch on both the cognitive, so the what we learn, the knowledge that we build, and the affective domains. So the why we learn, the emotions, attitudes, and values that contribute to our learning. So that's great, that's what we know, but what don't we know? There's still a whole lot to uncover in terms of really what's making up these valuable field experiences, and that's why groups like UFERN and research networks exist, to really sort of figure these things out. The affective aspects in particular are poorly understood. This probably isn't a problem that's unique to the field, but there is a lot of complexity that happens in field experiences that really makes this harder to uncover, I think. And in order to figure this out, we really need the students' perspectives. So we have to be talking to the students. We can't, it's great to understand how the instructors are interpreting things, but it's not the whole picture unless we hear from the students. And all this we know from the literature is important for motivation and interest. So both on the shorter term and recruitment and retention, so on the longer term. So this really is a crucial thing that we need to uncover. And of course, if you're all here today, I probably don't need to convince you of that, but it's good to make sure we're all on the same page. So more broadly, the research that I'll be talking about today fits into a larger study that was done as part of my PhD work. Our aims for this study were to uncover the nature of the development of sense of place in undergraduate geoscience students in the field, illustrate how sense of place is impacted by differences in field trips or students, and also understand how sense of place relates to motivation and environmental attitudes. Now, this study in particular looks at what effects do different instructors and variable weather conditions have on both the student field experience and sense of place. If you're interested in those more broader questions, we have a few works out that'll be in the reference list for this talk, and I'm happy to talk to them more at a later time, but today we'll focus on this idea of different instructors and weather. And for the study, we're kind of working with the idea that field trips should be robust in changing conditions, and we find that the location for field trips, at least in our experience, is often constant. It helps us build PCK, or pedagogical content knowledge, so knowledge of what particular challenges and strengths students have in that specific field area. And it also, on a practical sense, allows us to build up context for location access and also resource repositories, so specific resources about that field area. So we're working with that kind of context and assumption, and then looking at different instructors and variable weather and how those play into things. So the student field experience, we'll start by developing some working definitions for that. I really like how Tony Fegg puts this, and he calls the student field experience the essence of the field. And it's both internal, what happens in the students' minds, and also interactive, what happens on the outside. So our previous work helped to develop a small model for geology field trips based on previous findings from what we call situated trips. In our case for geology, these are sort of more mapping style trips where students are in one area, they spend a lot of time there, and they develop a map of the rock types in the area. They get to know that small area really well, and we call those situated field trips. So in this model, we have a student, this red circle here, who's embedded within a peer group, this larger blue circle, and they're occasionally interacting with their instructor, this yellow circle. So plus or minus instructor, occasionally interacting with them, but always situated within their peer groups and moving throughout the field area. The field area encompasses them at all times, and the assessment encompasses that area as well. And in this situated field trip, we found that what was really successful to helping students develop strong connections with the place and hence with the geology was having a student-centered pedagogy, having clear learning objectives that students themselves perceived, and again, having this assessment that really connects the whole region together. So that's our student field experience. Let's think about sense of place. So sense of place has had a lot of work done in developing it, and largely in human geography, environmental psychology, those sorts of fields. It can be very succinctly, as best I can try and make it succinct, defined as a collection of meanings and attachments that are built from engaging with and learning about places. So there's lots of great work on that, and that's sort of the definition that we'll be working with for this work today. Our previous work showed that place attachment, triangulated with interview findings, was sensitive to different field trips and students. So we found that measures of place attachment were robust in detecting differences in approaches to field trips and in the types of students that were on them. Now, some other work has looked at sense of place as connections between self, others, and the environment. So if we think again about this model that we've developed for these situated field trips, having the student within the peer group and their instructor occasionally interacting, again, housed within that field area, and we sort of superimpose this framework onto it, we have this kind of basic idea. So the student, of course, is the self, their peers and instructor are the others in this case, the other folks that they're interacting with, and the environment is the field area. So we're using this framework as sort of a way to think about our field trip model. And as I mentioned, this study will look at instructors, which is part of the others, and weather conditions, which is part of the environment. So those are working definitions for what we're going to be talking about today. Now, a little bit about our research setting so that you all can understand how this might apply to the context that you're working in. We had 3 6-day introductory geological mapping trips. Because the accommodation in this area is limited to 23 students, we had to sort of stagger these trips. So it's multiple consecutive field trip sections, and each of these field trip sections has a different instructor. So it proved to be a really unique and interesting case study to look at the student field experience and sense of place. I like to think of it as analogous to trips that run year to year. Say maybe you only have one field trip, you do multiple sections, but that trip's going to run again the following year, the following semester, and you might have different weather in those cases, or you might have a new instructor that comes in. All of these variables are still changing. We just had the, I guess, a fortunate opportunity to be able to investigate this all within 1 year. Now, the students are second-year geology majors. It's their first overnight field trip, and they work in self-selected groups of 2 to 4. There's a 90-minute drive to and from the field area, but there's no additional driving required. So once they're there, they are there. They step out the door from their accommodation and they're right within their field area. a little bit about the student population. I know there's a lot of numbers here, but just to summarize, our students were majority male students, so about 60-40 thereabouts on the trips, mostly between the ages of 18 and 21, and very dominantly Pakeha or NZ European or other Europeans, so very dominantly Caucasian students. So that's just a little bit of the breakdown, just to show you again how this sort of relates to your context. Now, the field accommodation here is in cottages that are used to house seasonal farm workers. So you can see it in the middle of the photo there, just to give you a sense of being able to place yourselves within that area. The instructors share the same accommodation, so it's not your typical field station. It's a working farm, and it's some pretty rustic cottages that seasonal farm workers are housed in. The weather conditions in the field area are important both for morale, of course, in any case, and also for access here in particular. So I'm just going to go back to that previous slide and show you, if you look at the bottom of the image, there's a waterway. It's fairly shaded, you can't quite see the water, but you can see that cliff drop off. There are a few major waterways within the area and some small creeks, and students use these both to access the area itself and to look at particular rock types, outcrops. So if the weather's poor and the flow's up in those waterways, it also impacts their ability to access particular sites of interest, and also their ability to move quickly throughout the field area. So if they don't have that shortcut, they lose some time due to having to travel further distances to access different areas of the field site. So in very brief, just to set up the differences in weather that we had on these 3 trips. On trip 1, we had by far the worst weather. So rain, sleet, snow, 2 days that even had to be cut short a little bit due to worsening conditions. I've been on about 6 of these trips, and the instructor who led this trip had been on 10 of them. And for both of us, it was by far the worst weather we'd ever seen in this particular place at that particular time of year. So pretty tough conditions for the students to be in. The trip that followed that, trip 2, was very dry, mostly warm and sunny. It's on the left here, figure A. So very dry, warm, sunny. Trip 3 was a little bit more of the in-between. It was mixed, so it had some gray, misty days and some partly cloudy days. And that's on the right-hand side of the figure there, figure B. That figure just shows you sort of the contrast of what the field area might look like in different environmental conditions. This is the same, the same structural feature, major structural feature in the mapping area. And that's what it looks like on a good day and on a kind of average day. So our study was mixed methods, and we used quantitative data to characterize place attachment across the population. And that was measured using a place attachment inventory, which has been used in geoscience before by Steve Samkin and Carol Butler Freeman. We had groups about 17, 18, 15 on trips 1, 2, and 3. And that's what we used to get sort of a broader sense of student sense of place. So in this case, their place attachment, their degree of connection with the field area. We use qualitative data to help uncover the sort of richness and complexity in those lived experiences of both the students and instructors. We did semi-structured interviews with students, 3 per trip, and these are deliberately selected. So they're not random, they're not intended to say that we can understand and generalize the whole population on this level, but instead we're looking at particular differences. We want to characterize some of the diversity in the group. So they were chosen to be different genders, not working in the same mapping pairs, different sort of interest and aptitude, both for the outdoors and for learning about geology, as much as you can with 3 students per trip. But the idea there is to get some diversity of beliefs and perceptions. We also did semi-structured interviews with all the instructors on these trips. And we coded these interviews for emergent themes relating to perceptions of field education, intended and perceived learning outcomes, and the field area. So essentially, topics that related to our research questions of interest. And we really did need to focus this down because the interviews range from about, I think, 15 to 45 minutes off the top of my head. So it was not feasible to analyze all of the data, but instead we focused on the questions that were of interest to us. We also did in-field observations to help characterize the setting in a narrative sense and contextualize the findings. So we just wanted a sense of what we were seeing, how might this relate to what actually happened in the field. And it was really important to be there and be on the ground and to see what was happening rather than getting a secondhand account. So that's a little bit about the study itself, the setup and the design. I thought it would be interesting to have you all predict how student place attachment compares on the different field trip sections. I'm not sure I can set up a poll though, so what I might do, since I can't see it obviously, is I'll get you to type into the chat window again. Same thing as we did with the why is field education valuable. I'm wondering how you think student place attachment compared on the different field trip sections. And let's say at the end of the field trip. So here are some choices for you, so you don't have to, oh yeah, we've already got a few coming in, which is great. So you can postulate on your own or pick one of those choices, A, B, C, D. Got a mix of better on the good weather and better on the bad weather. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to answer that, just your first instincts. And if you can, if you don't mind, make sure you have all panelists and attendees selected so everyone can see what you're saying. All right, so I'll give you about 10 seconds to wrap up. I'll do my best to summarize. It looks like a mix, but more for A than for B. So more for greater attachment on the fair weather section and lower on the poor weather. But a few saying maybe their attachment will be higher on the bad weather and lower on the good weather section. So maybe that idea that they've gone through some rough stuff together and that might actually help them develop a stronger connection, sort of that sense of accomplishment in that tough weather. All great ideas and things that we talked about before we started the study. We thought weather would be important because we know that when we go in the field, we struggle on the hard days. But interestingly, we saw the same attachment on all of the field trip sections. So there was no difference based on the weather or, for that matter, the instructor. So regardless of those changes, the students had the same place attachment on all of the sections. So we'll dig into the numbers a little bit more on that. Hopefully these numbers will be like a bit of a take home for you and I can focus you in on the key points. So focus here on the bottom. So this table shows the student average place attachment, both pre at the start of the field trip, post after the field trip, and the shift between those two. So in all cases, there was a significant shift in student attachment, so attachment to the field area from before to after the field trip. All cases, there was a significant shift. However, in pre, post, and shift, there was no significant difference between the groups. So they had a similar pre-attachment, a similar post-attachment, and similar shifts, all despite changing instructors and weather. So we thought this was pretty interesting. and genuinely quite surprising to us, like it seems like it was to many of you. So we thought we'd dig a little bit more into what those students were saying in the interviews. You know, this is what we've got in our data, and our previous work showed, again, that there was sensitivity in these instruments. So they were sensitive enough to show different types of field trips and different students. So take a look at the perspectives and see, are they really the same on all the trips? So in terms of the field experience, students said that they really appreciated the opportunity to build knowledge from the ground up and sort of put that data together. So some of the things that you all said when we were discussing the value of field education at the beginning of the webinar, they highlighted particular skills that they felt they built, and these were rock description and observations, note taking, getting good quality data, identifying imperfect rocks, and making interpretations. And these were similar across all the 9 students that we interviewed, so across all of the field trips. Here's just a quote to exemplify that. I'll give you about 30 seconds to read that. So that student said it was, the purpose of that field trip really was just trying to get us to get information from the field. Coming back and trying to put it together, we got back, I put it all down, and I linked it up, and it all made sense. That idea of really bringing all of that knowledge together and building their conception of the field area. When it comes to sense of place, many of the students recognize the importance of the geological variety available, so they got to see different rock types in one area, and they noted that it was appropriate for their academic level. So they felt that it was simple enough that it wasn't unachievable, but it was complex enough that they were being challenged and they were learning. So really interesting and important that they were noting these things as well. They didn't want to come back to the area. They felt they got to know it well enough in their 6 days there, but that actually learning about the geology helped enhance their appreciation for the landscape. So we put all of this together. That was a very brief introduction to the data. We had a lot more interview data too, but largely we were seeing that student perspectives were similar and student place attachment was similar on the trips. So then we went to the instructor interviews and to our observations in the field to try and figure out, okay, what are these things that are the same on the trips? The instructors were different and the weather was different, but what are they doing the same? What are they doing consistently that might help us build stronger field trips in the future? So the first of these things was the intended learning outcomes for the trip. There were similarities in each of the instructors' intended curricula, so they all had the same idea of what they wanted to teach the students. And this was on both a broad level, so why they felt like field education was important, connecting the classroom to the real world, developing a sense of ownership and independent problem-solving ability. And it was also in the field trip in particular. So they wanted to build core field skills. They wanted students to think creatively, and they wanted them to be able to make assumptions and use those assumptions to create geological interpretations. Again, those things are quite consistent with what was coming through from the students. Our observations showed us that students became increasingly autonomous as the instructors gradually reduced the amount of guidance they were giving to them in the field. And as I mentioned, students really saw a lot of this coming through. So they were perceiving these intended learning outcomes that the instructors were intending to put forward. The next important feature we recognized was this appreciation of the field area. So though the instructors didn't all have the same level of attachment, they noted that they had important educational features. So they had important features for teaching students about geology. And again, this theme came up. So the variety and the complexity of geology and that appropriate academic level. Instructors also noted a couple of things that students didn't note. The small field area, so the size of the field area, and this unique accommodation, this shears, quarters, cottages that is located within the field area that they don't have to leave and come back to. So the next feature we found to be important was the assessment. So the assessment was consistent between all the trips. The students had to build the same piece of work. They had to build a map and a cross-section. And this assessment was well aligned with what the intended curriculum was as stated by the instructors, and also what was perceived by the students. And this assessment in the situated mapping field trip style encompassed the whole field area. So it was directly connected to the landscape. This sort of situated setup allowed for ownership and exploration within the field area. And we know from our past work that this was really important for students developing a connection to the place and hence the geology. And they did this in these peer groups, right? So they had shared experience in peer relationships. And again, from our past work and from the literature on sense of place, we know those things are important. Now, lastly, it was important that the assessment was flexible to the weather. So the assessment had inbuilt flexibility. There was wiggle room for the expectations to be adjusted and for more guidance to be given when these adverse conditions were at play. But the instructors also had to be willing to exercise them, and that takes a certain level of flexibility. You need to be okay with the fact that you might have to change, you know, from your initial message, or you might have to offer more guidance, offer more information that you might not normally do when you want students to start becoming autonomous when they're in really tough conditions, both for their safety on a practical sense and also for ensuring that you reduce that cognitive load so that the students are not being overwhelmed by the horrible conditions and they're able to still get something out of their learning. They're able to still learn about the geology. And from our past work, we think that it's important for students to be within the field area, or at least in an environment that looks similar to the field area itself, because we've seen on multi-site trips that students tend to lose that attachment as they visit lots of different sites. So we think it might be particularly important here that not only was the assessment flexible, but that students had the opportunity to still stay within the field area. They didn't have to pack up and leave. But of course, some of that is totally out of our control. So I'm wondering, we have a quick minute here, what your thoughts might be on, of these 4 features, what you think is the most important. I know it's hard to pick a favorite child, so to speak, but which of these design features do you think is the most important takeaway for you? What's the most important in your design? So again, we'll just use that chat box. We've got social, cognition, and C, align and connected assessment, intended learning outcomes. Someone's written our students B, right? So this idea of what you need to focus on for your design might be different from different populations and different environments that you're working in. See a lot of C's and B's, a couple A's. I'll give you about 10 seconds to wrap up so that we've still got time for some questions at the end. Great, looks like we've slowed down. So there's really a mix of A and B and C, no D's, 1 all of the above. It's always a good answer to throw in there. Of course, I posed you guys something that's pretty challenging. I think it's okay to cheat in this case. It's hard to pick one, and really I just wanted to start us thinking about what would you have to focus on if you could only choose 1 or 2? Sometimes we do have to focus on a particular thing, or perhaps some of these things come easier to us and it's worth directing our attention to what we might not do as naturally, or what our particular students, as one of the participants mentioned, what our particular students need, and that's different with different populations. So thanks everyone, and thanks for bearing with the chat window there. Now I'll just wrap up by sharing you this model for how we think place attachment might develop over the field trip. There's a lot going on in this figure, so I'll give you about 30 seconds to just look at the key, look at the axes, and orient yourself in the figure before I step through explaining it. Great, so putting together that model that we developed in our previous work, we want to start to think about how place attachment might change over time. So on the x-axis here, we have increasing student autonomy or time throughout the field trip. And on the y, we've got increasing place attachment. So this is just a schematic based on our interviews and our observations, but it's nice to sort of put it all together. So initially in the field trip, you might have more instructor supported with a little bit of self-directed mapping, at least in the case of this field trip. So this yellow instructor circle is quite a bit bigger. The relative inputs of the instructor are fairly generous. And over that time, we're seeing a steady increase in place attachment, we might wager. Now, where that becomes a challenge is we might have, one of these weather events or some other kind of disruptive event that causes us to maybe detract a little bit from place attachment. The weather's coming, rain's coming down pretty hard. Maybe students might start to lose their place attachment. So they start to decrease in attachment or develop more of an aversion to the place. And that's where the instructor steps in and provides a little bit more guidance. So again, helps lessen that cognitive load and helps students focus on the learning. And we might hypothesize that in that case, their place attachment takes a bit of a turn and comes back up to level. And then our next stage would be sort of an intermediary exercise. So in this case, the students handed in a small mini map, so a subset of the area, and got feedback on it halfway through the trip. So this, we would hypothesize, would be a greater jump in place attachment. So they put something together, they feel like they know that place. Here they are. And then after they've done this and they've had that gain in place attachment, the instructor might decrease their input. So again, leaning more towards that self-directed mapping. Students are doing making more of the choices and taking that ownership in the field. And again, we might see a slight but steady increase in place attachment until the end of the field trip. So just to wrap up here, future work, I think it would be great to test this model in other settings. So we think this works based on our observations in our settings, but does it work in other places too? And of course, we need to characterize place attachment as it progresses throughout the trip. So we have some observations that might tell us where we think that we might see jumps in attachment and connection with the area. But exactly characterizing that in detail. We only have beginning and end data and observations, but that's just one part of the story. And that might help us identify other turning points like the scaffold exercise, that mini map, or weather, or all kinds of other things. And we'd like to understand a little bit more about how how instructors actually select their field areas. So what features are important? Are they valued like we found in this case, and why or why not? So just to summarize, we use connections between self, others, and environment to investigate impacts of instructors and weather conditions. We measured this with the surveys, observations, and interviews. We found similar place attachment and student experiences on all field trip sections. And we identified several contributing factors to this. So things that are important for design in the future is having intended learning outcomes that are consistent between instructors and perceived by students. Field area that is valued by instructors and these features apparent to students. Assessment that is connected between sections and aligned with intended learning outcomes and connected to the field area. and flexibility in that assessment and instructor implementation of that in order to adapt to adverse weather conditions. So now we're going to check in with Lori and see how the visual map has been progressing through the webinar.
Great. Let's see, I think if you unshare your screen, then I can
share.
All right. Let's select that. Okay, it's a little crazy over here. I can't beat it on a good day. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, so there's a lot of information we move through very quickly, and so I've been over here doing some drawing, put some of these questions on this map of can't beat it on a good day. There's some of these upfront questions here, why field education is important, the question and aim, and then the findings here related to the specific outing, which I've depicted over here, slightly different countryside, and there's some people having a good time. The internal versus external experience, both male and female represented in this study. This quote, when I got back, I linked it all up and it made sense. So that is depicted there. Then the table here for the impacts, weather and instructor. I have to move a couple more things around. This is definitely real-time drawing. I have a few more things to draw too. And then really coming through for that consistent design features. This is the list here that Dr. Jolley was pointing out, and then just seated in here this model for place attachment over time. Just started to catch the summary when we switched over to me, so I'll have a few more of those things to add as well. The one thing I do want to point out is when we asked the question, when Dr. Jolley asked the question, why is field education important? This is right from the chat box. So this is a unique map representing your voice. So I will also capture some of the Q&A likely as well. So thank you, and I will unshare my screen.
Thank you, Lori. Sorry for rushing through this summary there. Let me share my screen back over, and
so I think
great.
We're going to do questions now. Thank you so much, AJ and Lori. And just a reminder that we will definitely share Lori's visual map that she made, so y'all can have a better chance to take it in on your own time. So we're getting a couple questions. I just want to make sure we get to as many of them as we can. And if we can't get to all of them, we will work together to try to answer some of them and share those as well. I'm going to start with a couple that people put in the chat, AJ, before I think people had, oh yes, and someone asked about sharing AJ's slides too. I'm thinking, yep, okay, we'll do that too.
Absolutely.
Let's see, there's a question from Megan that I couldn't copy over. She says, which is cause and which is effect? Might increased attachment lead to increased autonomy? So, well, that's the question, I think, is cause and effect with autonomy and attachment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that based on our initial studies, that initial model I presented of the situated trip, we think that the autonomy is a key factor in students developing an attachment. So if we compared, in a previous study, we compared this sort of more situated trip with what we call a roadside trip, where students, visit lots of sites and get driven around and don't necessarily make as many choices about what they're doing and where they're going. And we didn't see any development of attachment in that environment. So we, based on our interviews and based on those differences, we think that the autonomy is a key component of developing that place attachment.
Okay, thank you, AJ. So the next question is from Sue. And she says, what effects, if any, do negative anthropogenic, she means anthropogenic events in the area, have you seen on the student attachment?
That's a great idea. Great question and a great idea for research. I'm trying to think if we saw anything like that. I don't have any good examples. Yeah, it would be a great thing to investigate there. You maybe might hypothesize that some negative anthropogenic effects might decrease students' attachment. But unfortunately, we don't have that. I don't have any comparisons from our data set that I could say that confidently.
Okay, thank you, AJ. So now I'm headed over to the Q&A box. Now I think everyone started typing it in there. So Alan Berkowitz asks, how do you reconcile the students' increased sense of place with their lack of interest in returning?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and something that it did surprise me to see that students were kind of done with it, but that's how they described it. Like, we don't, we like the place, we don't hate it, but we've been here for a long time and we feel like we know it all. That's probably, you know, they probably don't realize the full picture. They might not exactly know what more they could find out by visiting the place. It would be really interesting to get them back in that place and see what that does to their attachment. You know, are they really unwilling to revisit, or is it just that they want to go to other places? You know, like they just want to keep it different and interesting. And maybe there's some sort of a time, like a lag time on that. You know, can they, like, will that desire to revisit reappear in the future? Like, for example, I had a student, I showed him in the photo out in the rain looking happy. Angus, who's a co-author on this work, he was my field assistant, and he had been a student on the field trip the previous year. He was very, very excited to go back and go into that place. So, great question.
Okay, thanks. So we have the next question from Andrew, and he says, how can we apply what we've learned here to the classic roadside geology field trip when bouncing from outcrop to outcrop because of the large spatial scale of features and availability of outcrops? What are we trading off by visiting more places to tell the geologic history?
Again, a great question, and that's something that we really wanted to look at as a part of this study. So in the reference list for this talk, which I'll share with you on the slides, we have another piece of work where we developed that situated model to look at the comparison with the roadside trip. And we really do think there is a trade-off, but we think that there are some considerations for design that can help mitigate this sort of, well, not decrease, but this static attachment, so no change in attachment that we were seeing on these roadside trips. And we think a key part of this is having an assessment or some theme that really connects all of these outcrops together. So there's clearly a drive to go, no pun intended, to go to these roadside field trips because we want to tell regional histories, right? We don't always look at rocks and geology on that small of a scale, but we need, in those cases, we need probably just to try a little bit harder and with more intention to actually connect those sites together, both for ourselves and for the students. So in the case that we saw, the instructors really thought they were making those regional connections clear, but it wasn't coming through to the students. So we think that an assessment piece that actively asks students to build that regional story might be a sort of, you know, easy is probably the wrong word, but might be a more intuitive way to help build that together.
Thank you, AJ. Couple more questions. Scott Simon asks, do you know if this was a first outdoor experience for any of the students?
Good question. I do have data on that. I don't have it on hand. Anecdotally, yes, a good number of them. Probably, to be honest, probably fewer than we would see with North American students, because there is a greater integration of outdoor activities in high school curricula in New Zealand, and also in sort of the national way of being. The that idea of the outdoors and conservation is very much ingrained into a lot of Kiwi culture, but certainly there were some, and I did try when I interviewed them to pick ones who didn't necessarily look as, or who had actively expressed that they weren't as comfortable in the outdoors. But we are still seeing those similar themes, at least about the field experience and about sense of place coming through.
All right. I think we'll see. We have 2 more questions. We can get at least one in.
Cool.
And Alan, I'm going to skip over your question till later and get someone who hadn't asked a question yet. So this person asked, can you please share more specific information about the place attachment surveys, in particular what the format and question type was and how they were numerically scored?
Yeah.
I wonder if we want to just follow up with, if you send us an email, maybe we can send you that.
Happy to.
Or I could get that to you. Maybe you can put it in the chat or email directly to kari.o'connell@oregonstate.edu. And then let's squeeze in Eric's kind of comment question about, Eric says, interesting that the field and the graphic has to involve mountains and hiking. Just thinking about inclusive practices here. I guess it's more comment, but if you have anything to add to that.
I think that's a great point, and something that we should always be cognizant of in what we're putting forward in our imagery, and I'm totally guilty of it in this talk, right? You know, there are pictures from, all the pictures in this talk are from the field work that was done for this study, but it does carry a certain sense of ruggedness in a lot of cases and physicality that isn't, I think, doesn't do credence to the diversity that we have in our geoscience population that we should have. So I absolutely agree that we need to do a better job of modeling the field as a place for all folks.
Thank you so much, AJ. I just wanted to tell everyone that Steve Semkin put a link with the paper with that information.
Thank you, Steve.
Yep, about the place attachment surveys in the chat. So if anyone else is interested in that, you can grab that quick before we end. Let's see. I want to just end with a quick, first I want to say a virtual clapping for AJ and Lori. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed that. And thank you for answering all the questions. And then I just want to leave the group with, if you want to get more involved with UFERN and what we're doing, here's some ways you can get involved. And I forgot to add this announcement, but again, our next webinar is on January 24th, and we will be sending that out over the listserv. So thank you again for everyone coming and providing a really thoughtful discussion for all of us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.